The left's means. This section includes a sample organizational overview of the left's network that includes a review of the cultural and institutional means based on tasks related to the overall political warfare model. The means that the left emphasizes securing the greatest control over are those related to institutional, corporate, and media power in furtherance of securing a mass line from which it can then power down into the political to take power. An illustrative example of organizations in the chart below indicates a sustained, large-scale effort arrayed in furtherance of its objectives. The following list uses a midfield articulation of means approach: military, paramilitary, terrorist, individual actors, surrogate force individuals and groups, IS, AQ, etc., Antifa, BLM, etc., digital and cyber communications, weapons, unsecured borders, training programs for Antifa operatives, violent and semi-violent activists, surrogate forces including street gangs, MS-13, ISIS, and AQ. Information. Quote, journalists also reflectively subscribe to cultural Marxist notions of class. They have internalized them so thoroughly that they no longer even think about them. That the residue of evil should also be evil is beyond their comprehension, since the only evil they will admit to is that of their ideological opponents. Unquote. Eric Hoffer, The True Believer, 1951. Education. Co-opt universities and school books, a primary line of effort to their campaign. Communications, use of their own lexicon, terms of art. Hollywood and entertainers and emergent sport entertainment industry, ESPN. Purpose-built information and influence organizations, Media Matters. Online recruiting, conferences, propaganda. Census operations, polling, and surveys. Co-opted U.S. government officials who support leftist agenda. Interfaith programs. Diplomatic. International bodies including the UN, the EU, the OSCE, the OAS, the OIC et al. Andy Stern, SEIU, and Obama, Soros memo on Madison Welfare Office. David Brock, Media Matters, Democracy Alliance, American Bridge. OFA, Obama, Hollywood, Jake Sullivan, John Podesta, Ben Rhodes, Networks, 990s. Financial, individual and institutional donors. Intelligence, Right-Wing Watch, media organizations, civil rights councils and local governing boards, dual-use organizations, transportation, immigration advisors, Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, USG institutions' inappropriate use of personal information, systematic purge of non-conforming individuals and political opposition, possible penetration of USG intelligence and LE apparatus. Economic, IRS targeting, boycotts and supporting media campaigns, OWS, deep pocket billionaires on the left leveraging U.S. corporate and financial institutions, social media, blocking e-commerce, legal, SPLC, hate speech laws, lawfare, legal coercion targeting opponents, parallel counter-state legal constructs implemented through narratives, manipulation of immigration law, employment law, equal opportunity law, all groups-based and related otherist rights designations, ACLU. Development, community development organizations, questionable voter registration efforts, social welfare programs, foreign funding of community development. In addition to organizations and resources like those cited above, there are also functional capabilities groups that serve as means as well. The left's use of narratives. The left uses dialectically determined political warfare concepts to drive a core set of narratives that interoperate at the tactical level while integrating at the strategic. The left moves dialectically through time on a trajectory. The phrase, "the left moves dialectically through time on a trajectory," can be visualized by analogy to the solar system. As with the dialectic, there is a tendency to visualize the solar system as a static, two-dimensional representation, lending itself to flat, horizontal analysis that become further convoluted by the tendency to mirror image non-dialectical expectancies, as if the left's strategies and tactics mirror image the non-dialectical, as if in a match between two opposing players in a checkers match. The solar system actually operates helically through space in 3 dimensions, such that its backward trajectory defines its forward motion, just as the thesis-antithesis binaries drive the dialectical engines forward. As such, analysis of the left based on flat symmetrical assessments tend to be little more than illusory projections that reflect what are actually dynamic, vertical, helical attacks. While the heliocentric helix is science, the solar system as a vortex is pseudoscience. As a pseudo-reality generating engine, however, the dialectic has the characteristics of a vortex. Narratives are associated with the pseudo-realities, or second realities, they seek to establish and enforce. They are called narratives because they are stories, fictions, that seek to supplant the real with the unreal. First principle truths not only do not need narratives to defend their status, they are undermined by the very decision to respond to second reality narratives in the second reality, in the narrative. Narratives are directional, they have velocity, and there is always a target. Narratives should not be understood simply as flat, disassociated two-dimensional attacks that operate horizontally on a static plane. Rather, they should be understood as interactive double helix attacks, dialectical attacks, orienting on a target where the dialectic moves forward as the two helical poles, thesis and antithesis, engage designated targets, either for destruction or for positioning for later destruction. While narratives are only a means, they are central to understanding the mechanics of political warfare campaigns. It is through the narratives that the left controls the information environment while driving outcomes regarding specific issues and events. They are always directional, they have velocity, and there is always a target. With the controlled opposition settling on the words that seem to work for them in the pseudo-reality, the left enjoys uncontested supremacy in the information battle space. Interoperative narratives serve overall political warfare objectives through political, mobilize and garner resources from individuals and organizations concerned about grievance. Alliances, bring allies to the movement through direct or indirect concerns about issues identified. Importantly, the narratives also inhibit opposition, the base that elected Trump. Violence, shape violent attacks to legitimize counterstate actions that delegitimize self-defense by those targeted. Attack those who believe in America as racist, sexist, xenophobes, blame them, and attack First and Second Amendments. Nonviolence, legal, economic actions in support of and tied directly to their narrative initiatives, boycotts, etc. Sanctuary, reinforce perceptions among counterstate operatives that they are in the right and prevent dissent among the left. Properly understood, analysis of the left is analysis of the messaging strategies it uses to negate America in pursuit of a post-American effort to control the hell it creates. Just like Marx and Alinsky suggested, just like Venezuela, it is the process Vogelin's imaginator uses to affect the libido dominante of megalomaniacs. The left's core message is one of negation, framed around various otherisms, structured to delegitimize the very idea of America. Hence, America is oppressive, fundamentally flawed, and must be changed in order to be redeemed. But from what to what? For what? Narratives are integrated throughout the left's political warfare scheme and operate across all 5 political warfare lines of effort as depicted above. The following discussion of narratives does not examine every narrative in detail, but rather illustratively explains how archetype narrative forms should be analyzed using political warfare metrics. At present, the cornerstone effort of the left is to delegitimize President Trump and disenfranchise the base that elected him. The left is proficient at audience segmentation and analysis that crafts messages for various target audiences, including the left, mainstream, conservatives, the non-affiliated, and the apolitical. Narrative development targeting these groups is mindful of the backdrop schema and consistently seeks to reinforce overall themes. The left leverages the latest in strategic influence capabilities from the marketing and media world. Transmedia campaigns include the sophisticated integration of media that ranges from editorial control of the news cycle to embedding targeted themes into entertainment platforms, movies, TV programming, etc., to social media, to bumper stickers and yard signs. The Transmedia Approach involves a three-tiered narrative design composed of backdrop, supporting, and meta-narratives. The backdrop narrative is the first layer and serves as the backdrop on which meta and supporting narratives are expressed. It is a cultural Marxist backdrop that becomes omnipresent in other messaging efforts. Meta and supporting narratives always operate in support of the backdrop. Supporting narratives are the second layer. They are interchangeable as events warrant and do not have to be accurate to be used. As noted, supporting narratives derive validation from the backdrop narratives they support and serve to channel audience perception to associated meta-narratives. The final layer is composed of meta-narratives. They are often used at the point of attack and tend to be the most tactical. Meta-narratives drive specific action-reaction cycles to desired outcomes. The objective of this layered approach is the control of the movement and the channeling of public perception to a societal belief over the life cycle of the narrative. An example of the interplay of the three-tiered approach will use the archetype narratives used to attack President Trump in his first 2 years. The meta-narrative. Meta-narratives seek to delegitimize President Trump, his administration, and the vision of America he projected as a candidate. With cultural Marxist memes serving as the backdrop, President Trump is to be relentlessly characterized as unfit. Hence, President Trump is illegitimate, President Trump is corrupt, President Trump is dishonest. Supporting narrative. Meta-narratives will be supported by an ongoing series of supporting narratives that can be swapped out as circumstances warrant. It is important to recognize that these stories do not have to be true, valid, or accurate to serve their purpose. Over time, deserved or not, the cumulative effect of these supporting narratives will result in Trump fatigue. From a political warfare perspective, if President Trump is made to appear unable to meet these narrative challenges, he will be cast as a weak, failed leader. The current list of supporting narratives include Russia hacked the election, illegitimate, obstruction of justice, corrupt, hiding collusion, dishonest, Putin puppet, treasonous. Backdrop narratives. The backdrop to the meta and supporting narratives are cultural Marxist memes designed to sustain a general sense of loathing of President Trump and the deplorable Americans who elected him. Hence, meta, President Trump is illegitimate. Supporting, he was elected because of Russian hacking. Backdrop, and besides, he is a racist, sexist, xenophobe. Bernie Sanders tweet, quote, "Here is the simple truth. We have a president who is a racist, a president who is a sexist, a president who is a homophobe, a president who is a xenophobe, and a president who is a religious bigot. We have got to confront that truth and reject Trump's bigotry." Unquote. November 14, 2018. Metrics. Lacking any substantive appreciation for the strategic nature of the left, the ability to mount a strategic response is forfeited. As discussed, one of the left's earliest and most successful efforts has been to deprive the opposition of any useful language to define or otherwise articulate it. It is just this simple. If you successfully deprive your opposition of the language to define you, you take away that opposition's ability to target you. Over time, victory is assured. You cannot defeat a threat you choose not to define. This can be compounded when the deprived target is unaware of the state of its own deprivation. This is the state of mind that led people to warn that once a fictitious reality is successfully fabricated, the public becomes, quote, reduced to a state where people are not only unable to find out about the truth, but also become unable even to search for the truth, because they are satisfied with the deception and trickery that have determined their convictions, satisfied with a fictitious reality created by design through the abuse of language, unquote. The pushback on reintroducing defining terms like Marxism continues to generate resistance from those with whom this assessment is discussed. The left exploits this vulnerability and gauges its overall strategic approach using tangible and intangible measures of effectiveness. Analysis leading to the development of strategic responses to the left must account for the left's own understanding of its own strategic design. As Winston Churchill famously observed, quote, no matter how enmeshed a commander becomes in the elaboration of his own thoughts, it is sometimes necessary to take the enemy into account, unquote. If the success criteria of a plan to defeat the left does not account for the left's own defeat criteria, that plan will only focus on the mirror-imaged elaborations of the planners and will fail. This is especially true given the dialectical nature of the left's movements in which, if the first attack fails, it often still succeeds at positioning the target for the follow-on attack, which is generally lethal. For example, when a conservative civil rights organization chooses to respond to a hate speech attack by countering with its own hate speech accusations, it validates the hate speech narrative at the expense of the First Amendment principles that find hate speech abhorrent. The conservative rights group responded to the narrative in Vogelin's second reality. In the narrative, the constitutional defense is compromised, and the conservative class that organization represents is positioned for negation in the follow-on attack. They become doomed as the constitutional principle is nihilized. This is because, at all times, the hate speech narrative is an exclusive weapon of the left, born of Marcuse's repressive tolerance that does not recognize the rights of conservatives to have a voice in its tolerant society. The left assesses its political warfare success and decides upon the synchronization and phasing of its operations through a correlation of forces analysis across the various lines of effort when compared to the capabilities of the opposition. Correlation of forces analysis arose out of the science of the Marxist-Leninist Wissenschaft Sozialismus, or scientific socialism, which posits as a scientific certainty that the world is dialectically evolving towards socialism and that it is the role of the left to oversee the associated march of history as the vanguard of the proletariat it structures for that purpose. Science in the service of imposing a competing cultural metaphysic is the scientism of Hegel's reason discussed earlier. Applied to political warfare regimes, dialectical evolution seeks a favorable correlation of forces along the 5 lines of effort when matched against the target as a precondition of progressing further in its operational planning. Unsurprisingly, schemas arising from correlation of forces assessments seek to clarify political conflict down to the interaction of 2 antagonistic camps that position an American ideal against its antithesis, thus positioning it for a series of dialectical turns. Correlation of forces analysis accounts for a number of factors, including 1. The national perception of the left's aims is gauged by recruiting, fundraising, and mobilization for their causes. 2. Local perception of the left's aims. And 3. The correlation of the left's intended outcomes with those of their allies when positioned against the opposition. The left puts its main effort in the political line of effort as part of its overall political warfare approach. As an illustrative example, a sampling of possible tangible and intangible metrics that the left uses to measure the effectiveness of its information efforts is provided. Tangibles, objectively measurable events and activities. Gun purchases, weapons ownership, institutional policy conformity, electoral cycles, judicial presence, legislative, legal victories, media presence, reporting skewed, especially headlines and placement, funding raised, number of groups, organizations, and people mobilized, silence in the face of leftist violence and coercion. Opposition party adopts left's position based on narrative compliance or donors. Americans unwilling to vocalize support for America. De facto enforcement of counter-state speech codes. Campus and academy worst. Ability to create tactical mass mobilization. Stampede. Attacks on police and symbols of rule of law. Attacks on historical facts. Control of leadership of government institutions. Government responses protect left narratives at the expense of the rule of law. Sovereignty reductions. Foreign laws, speech codes, applied through corporations and institutions. Illegal immigration numbers. Playback of their narratives by members of the opposition party. Intangibles, a subjective measurement, primarily through polling. Cool factor, perception of left as fighting oppression, virtuous, open, good. Demoralized conservative base. Conservatives accept judicial fiat in sociocultural rulings. Acceptance of government corruption, but only when undertaken by the left. International perception of America. Youth perception of American conservatives.